So with this lecture, what I want to do is talk a little bit about epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues are one of the four major tissue types in the body, with the others being connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Before we get into the specifics of what makes up an epithelial tissue and how they're actually named, what I want to do is talk a little bit about what epithelial tissues are. So what separates them from some of the other types of tissues and some of the special characteristics that epithelial tissues have. So if you focus for a minute on the diagram that I have here, you'll notice that I've got a description of epithelial tissues down here at the bottom. It says epithelial tissues cover body surfaces and they line body cavities. So anywhere that you've got a surface of the body, like the skin, that's an epithelial tissue. Any body cavities, like the mouth, is lined with epithelial tissue as well. Because epithelial tissues are found lining body surfaces and covering body cavities, they always have a free surface. So what I mean by that is there's a portion of the epithelial tissue that isn't attached. If you look at this artist's representation of an epithelial tissue, that's what we're seeing here is kind of a cartoon diagram of an epithelial tissue, if you will. These cells that are represented in kind of this tannish color that have the blue nuclei, those are the actual epithelial tissues. And you'll notice that represented in purple, beneath those epithelial cells, we have another tissue type, but up above the surface of the epithelial tissues, we have free space. We have an open area. Basically, it's just air. If this is your skin, for example, this would be underlying tissue down here, and this portion of the skin that I'm outlining with my little finger isn't attached to anything. This is just air above the skin or whatever, something like that. So if you see epithelial tissues under a microscope, one of the things that's kind of a key characteristic about them is they always have a free surface. They have a surface that isn't attached to anything else because that's one of their characteristics. Because epithelial tissues have a free surface, another characteristic of them is that they are polar. So when we were in the chemistry section, we talked about polar meaning effectively charged, that you've got these opposite charges on the two ends of a molecule. When we're talking about polar from the standpoint of an epithelial tissue, what that means still is that the two sides are different in some way, but it doesn't mean that they're charged differently. So I want to give you some descriptions, some definitions, and then we'll talk about what polarity means. So all epithelial tissues have what's known as an apical surface. I'm going to draw for you right along here where I'm drawing this red line. That's the apical surface of the epithelial tissue. And it's called the apical surface because it's the surface that isn't attached to anything else. If we go down below that, epithelial tissues also have basal surfaces as well. So I'm going to draw a little line again in red that shows this is our basal surface. Okay, it's the surface that's attached into underlying tissues that are represented down here in purple. So that's what we're talking about when we say that epithelial tissues are polar. It means they have an apical surface. They have one surface that isn't attached to any other cells or any other tissues, and that's the surface along here, this upper surface. And then they have a lower surface or a basal surface which is attached into underlying tissues, and that's this lower area here. I mentioned previously that these cells that are represented in tan with the blue nuclei are the actual epithelial tissue. What I want you to notice is there's kind of a darker purple line right along here, right along that basal surface that sits between the epithelial cells and also the connective tissue. So you can see that right along here, that dark purple line. And this is what's known as the basement membrane. So the basement membrane isn't a tissue, it's really just a protein. It's there to kind of support the epithelial tissue, to connect the epithelial tissue into the tissue that underlies it. So it's really just kind of a reinforcer. Another thing that's unique about epithelial tissues that separate them from some of the other tissue types is they have specialized contacts. So when I'm talking about specialized contacts, what I'm actually meaning is that the cells themselves that make up the epithelial tissue, in the areas where they join to each other, we've got these specialized contacts that help to hold them together really strongly. So again, if you go back to thinking about what epithelial tissues do and where we find them covering body surfaces, we find them lining body cavities as well. So these are going to be areas where there's a lot of friction. There could potentially be a lot of pulling forces on these tissues. And for that reason, we need to have the cells that make up these epithelial tissues really, really strongly bound together. Another thing that we see that's unique to epithelial tissues is they are supported by underlying tissue, as I said before, so represented here in purple, kind of where I'm waving this little finger around. And this tissue that underlies our epithelial tissues is always connective tissue. So we'll get into connective tissues and some of the specific types of connective tissues later on. But for now, know that epithelial tissues are always laying on top of a bed of connective tissue that just kind of helps to support them and connect them into underlying structures in the body. Another thing that's unique about epithelial tissues is they are avascular. So what I mean by that is these cells that are up in here that are actually making up that epithelial tissue don't have a blood supply to them. So there are no blood vessels that penetrate up into the epithelial tissue. They are, however, innervated. So you know that you can feel, for example, something hot or something cold that's touching your skin. You can feel when something pricks you, and the reason for that is there are nerve endings that extend up into the epithelial tissue of your skin. However, there are not blood vessels that penetrate up that high. Epithelial tissues, because of that, are required to get their blood supply, their oxygen, their nutrients from the connective tissue that underlies them. So basically, these connective tissues that epithelial tissues sit on top of do have blood vessels, and the oxygen and the nutrients from those blood vessels has to diffuse up into these cells of the epithelial tissues in order to provide them with the oxygen and the nutrients that they need. One last thing that's really unique about epithelial tissues is they are very, very capable of regeneration. So a lot of the tissues in the body, if you think about some of our organs, some of our other tissues, if they're damaged, they're damaged. They're not capable of repairing themselves to a great extent. They're not capable of replacing themselves. And with epithelial tissues, that's not the case. Epithelial tissues are really good at regeneration, and they have to be because they line body cavities and they cover body surfaces. So again, they're in these areas of the body where they're being exposed to a lot of forces, a lot of friction, which tend to damage these types of tissue. If you think about the skin as an example of an epithelial tissue, it regenerates, so it completely replaces itself about once a month. So again, these are tissues that are very, very good at regeneration, and that's another one of their unique properties. The last thing that I want to do in talking about epithelial tissues is I want to go into how epithelial tissues are actually named. So as you're learning these epithelial tissues, you're going to find that they have some kind of crazy names like simple squamous epithelium or stratified cuboidal epithelium or pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And if you understand where they're getting their names from, it makes it a lot easier to be able to understand what epithelial tissues are, and from there kind of start to understand what epithelial tissues do, where you would find them specifically in the body. So there's a couple of things that epithelial tissues are named based on. The first part of their name is simple or stratified, and that's just giving you information about how many layers of cells are actually making up the tissue. So if you look at this first tissue right here, this artist's representation of an epithelial tissue, you'll notice we've got a single layer of cells. So the reason I say that is there's no cells stacked on top of another cell. We've got a single layer of cells, a single level of nuclei, and so this is a tissue that would be referred to as simple. If you have just one layer of cells in your epithelial tissue, it's a simple epithelial tissue. If you've got several layers of cells that are stacked one on top of another, like you're seeing in this diagram the lower diagram below where I now have my finger. Now you've got what's known as a stratified tissue. So the first part of its name is going to be stratified something epithelial tissue. The second thing that epithelial tissues are named based on is the shape of the cells. So we've got roughly 3 types of cells that you see epithelial tissues being formed into. The first, if you look up here where I've got my little finger pointer, is what's known as a squamous shaped cell. So if you look at this picture, this is looking at it kind of from above. Here's looking at a squamous shaped cell from a side view. And you'll notice that these are cells that are really flat. They look like somebody just stepped on top of them. And they have a nucleus typically that you can see really well when you're looking at these tissue types under a microscope slide. That really is flat also. So if you look down here, okay, this is a single layer of cells. The cells are of a flattened shape. So what this actually is a simple squamous epithelium. Here's another type of shape of cell that we can see in these epithelial tissues. So again, this is looking at it kind of from above. Here we're seeing it from a side view, the way that you would normally see it under a microscope. This is called a cuboidal shaped cell. And the reason for that is if you look at its shape, it's basically a cube. Another thing that's really key about these cuboidal shaped cells, and I actually find this to be more helpful when I'm looking at them under a microscope, is if you look at the nucleus here in purple, it's almost perfectly spherical and it sits right in the middle of that cube-shaped cell. So when you have cells of this particular shape, then they are a simple cuboidal epithelium if you've got a single layer of these cube-shaped cells, or you could also have a stratified cuboidal epithelium as well if there are more than one layer of cells making up the tissue. Here's our last tissue shape, or our last cell shape that we see in epithelial tissue. So these are what are known as columnar shaped cells. This is again kind of looking at it a little bit more three-dimensionally, maybe from above. Here's the side view, what you would more commonly see when you're looking at epithelial tissues under a microscope slide. So you'll notice, as the name implies, that really this is a column-shaped cell. It's kind of elongated vertically. Another thing that's really key about these columnar-shaped cells is if you look at the nucleus, they tend to sit kind of towards the bottom of that cell, and they tend to be elongated vertically, okay? So they're not perfect little round circles, but they're elongated in the same direction that the cell is actually elongated. So when you are looking at a tissue that has cells that are columnar-shaped, you're dealing with either a simple columnar epithelium, again, if there's only a single layer of cells, or a stratified columnar epithelium if there are 2 or more layers of cells.